Mysteries whisper from the ancient earth, woven into the very soil beneath our feet. These are the forgotten voices of an age of iron and bronze, of peoples who left no great cities of stone, no sprawling empires with written laws, but instead left behind the echoes of their culture, their beliefs, and their epic journeys. We look at a mysterious burial mound in a silent field, or a finely crafted bronze torch pulled from a forgotten bog, and we are left to wonder about the people who made them, the people we have come to know as the Celts. They are a people whose story is less about monuments and more about a spirit that endured, a way of life that shaped a continent, and a legacy that still resonates in the far western fringes of Europe. It's a story of warriors and poets, of gods and goddesses of the land, and of a defiance that would one day challenge the greatest power the ancient world had ever known. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening to this in the quiet of your room, let us know where you are and what time it is. We're all listening together, across the miles, as we drift off into the ancient past. The journey begins not with a war horn or a grand proclamation, but with the quiet, gradual emergence of a distinct material culture in the heart of Europe. We're talking about the Hallstatt culture, which flourished from around 1200 to 450 BC. Imagine a time when iron was just beginning to replace bronze as the metal of choice. The Hallstatt people were expert craftsmen, forging swords and spears of a strength their ancestors could only dream of, and their influence spread across what is now Central Europe. Their name comes from a specific site, a beautiful little lakeside town in Austria, where a huge cemetery and a massive salt mine were discovered. The salt was their gold, their currency of power and prestige, and it allowed them to trade far and wide, building a network of influence that stretched across the Alps. The graves there tell a silent, fascinating story. They aren't just simple burials, they're packed with treasures. The elite were laid to rest in large burial mounds, surrounded by iron weapons, ornate jewelry, and even four-wheeled wagons. These aren't the simple nomadic peoples of some later Roman propaganda. These were sophisticated, stratified societies with a clear warrior aristocracy, men and women of immense wealth who controlled trade routes and resources. Their art, while not as famous as what would follow, was distinctive, featuring geometric patterns and stylized animals. It's in these burial goods and the patterns of trade that historians first see the glimmer of what would become the Celtic world, a shared cultural language expressed in metal and clay. From the embers of the Hallstatt culture, a new, more dynamic style emerged around 450 BC, known as the La Tène culture. The name comes from a site in Switzerland where a large number of artifacts were found, but the style itself was anything but Swiss. It exploded across Europe, from what is now France and Belgium to parts of Italy, Germany, and even reaching into the Balkans. The art of La Tène is what most people think of when they picture Celtic art. It's fluid and curvaceous, moving away from the rigid geometric shapes of Hallstatt. We see swirling abstract patterns, interlacing animal motifs, and enigmatic human faces hidden within the designs. This art wasn't just decoration, it was a form of symbolic expression, appearing on everything from bronze helmets and shields to gold torques and brooches. The famous Gundestrup cauldron, a magnificent silver vessel found in a Danish bog, is a breathtaking example of this style, depicting scenes of gods, goddesses, and mysterious rituals. This transition from Hallstatt to La Tène isn't a neat, clean break. It's more like a blossoming, a cultural evolution where a shared foundation of language and custom gave rise to a stunningly unique artistic identity. And while we can't definitively say that every person who practiced Hallstatt or La Tène culture spoke a Celtic language, the archaeological evidence is very compelling. These two cultures, one preceding the other, represent the archaeological bedrock upon which the historical Celts would be built. It is here in the fertile lands of Central Europe that the Celts began to truly take shape as a distinct group, a powerful force that would soon spill over its borders and into the pages of history. This wasn't a single unified empire, but a vast network of tribes, each with its own name and identity: the Boii, the Helvetii, the Aedui, yet all sharing a common thread of culture, art, and belief. The Romans, who would later spend a great deal of time and effort trying to conquer them, simply called them the Galli, or Gauls, a general term for these fierce, long-haired warriors who lived beyond their northern frontiers. The Greeks likewise referred to them as the Keltoi. And so, a people with no singular name for themselves became known by the names given to them by their neighbors, a quiet irony for a culture that valued epic, individualistic heroism so highly. This initial period, from the Iron Age origins in the Hallstatt culture to the full flourishing of the La Tène style, sets the stage for everything that would follow. It's the moment before the great migrations, the calm before the storm, and a testament to the ingenuity and artistic spirit of a people whose story is about to unfold across the entire continent. The mystery of their origins, a subject of much scholarly debate, lies buried in these early sites. We know they were here, but we can only guess at the specific ways they saw themselves and the world around them, a world they were about to change forever. From these heartlands of Central Europe, the Celtic world began to stretch its limbs, a phenomenon we call the Great Celtic Expansion. It wasn't a single, organized movement, with a grand general leading the way, but a series of migrations and conquests that saw Celtic tribes moving in all directions, like spokes on a wheel. One of the earliest and most impactful movements was southwest, into the Iberian Peninsula, what is now Spain and Portugal. Here, they mingled with the indigenous peoples, creating a unique hybrid culture known as the Celtiberians. These were a hardy people, renowned for their skills as warriors and their distinctive double-edged iron swords, the falcatas. The Romans would later find them to be some of their most stubborn and formidable opponents, a testament to the Celtiberians' courage and fighting spirit. This southwestern expansion demonstrated the Celtic ability to adapt, to absorb, and be absorbed by other cultures while still retaining core elements of their own. Meanwhile, other tribes were moving west, crossing the narrow channel into the British Isles. The story here is a little more complex, and historians still debate whether this was a mass migration or a more gradual process of cultural diffusion. Either way, by the time of the Romans, the islands of Britain and Ireland were thoroughly Celtic in language and culture. The tribes here, like the Brigantes in the north and the Iceni in the east, were just as fierce and independent as their continental cousins. They built hill forts, traded widely, and had a rich oral tradition, with bards and druids at the heart of their society. This western migration planted the seeds of the Celtic identity that we recognize today, far from the original homelands, in the lands where the languages and traditions would hold on longest. But perhaps the most dramatic and far-reaching expansion was to the east and south. Celtic tribes pushed down into the Balkans, clashing with the Greeks and Thracians, and even coming into direct conflict with the powerful kingdom of Macedon. They served as mercenaries, fought as raiders, and for a time posed a significant threat to the Hellenistic world. It's an amazing thought, isn't it? These people, with their swirling Latin art and their tribal war bands, facing off against the heirs of Alexander the Great. They were admired and feared in equal measure for their bravery in battle, often fighting naked or wearing little more than a torque around their necks, a display of raw, almost unbelievable confidence. The Celts were not just a force of destruction, however. They also settled. A significant group crossed into Asia Minor, a part of modern-day Turkey, and established a kingdom for themselves known as Galatia, named after the Greek word for Celts. They were a powerful presence there for centuries, a Celtic island in a sea of Greeks and Anatolians. The Apostle Paul would later write letters to the people of Galatia, the same people whose ancestors had come from the heart of Europe. Another, and perhaps the most famous, expansion was south into Italy. For a long time, the Po Valley in northern Italy was home to numerous Celtic tribes, so much so that the Romans called it Cisalpine Gaul, or Gaul on this side of the Alps. They traded with and raided the Etruscans and the early Romans, and their presence was a constant source of anxiety for the growing Roman Republic. This culminated in one of the most shocking events in early Roman history, a moment we will explore in more detail later, a moment when the Romans learned to fear the Gauls. The Celts were a very real and present danger, not some distant mythical people. This entire process of expansion, spanning centuries, was not a simple march of conquest. It was a complex, messy affair of migration, cultural exchange, and fierce, often brutal, warfare. The Celts weren't just a single entity. They were many, with different dialects, customs, and rivalries. Yet, they shared enough of a common culture, their love of feasting and drinking, their warrior ethos, their distinctive art, their religious practices, to be recognized as a single, if loosely defined people by the outside world. This period of expansion, from roughly 400 BC onwards, marks the high point of Celtic power and influence. They were a force that shaped the geopolitical landscape of the ancient world, from the British Isles to the Black Sea, leaving a legacy that, while later overshadowed by the rise of Rome, would prove to be remarkably resilient. It's a story of a people on the move, fearless and fierce, carrying their culture and their swords across a continent. A story of a society that, despite its lack of a centralized state, managed to create a pan-European cultural sphere that was as rich as it was diverse. They were everywhere, it seemed, and their story was just beginning to truly unfold. With the Celts now spread far and wide, a closer look at their society reveals a complex and deeply rooted culture, far removed from the simple savagery that Roman propaganda would later suggest. At the top of the social pyramid was a powerful warrior aristocracy. These were the chiefs and kings who ruled the various tribes, and their status was often based on a combination of lineage, wealth, and military prowess. Their lives revolved around feasting in great halls, listening to bards, and of course, the constant practice of warfare and raiding. They were the ones who owned the finest weapons, the ornate bronze shields, and the stunning gold torques that served as a symbol of their rank. The social structure wasn't a rigid, hereditary system in the way of later European monarchies. A person could rise through the ranks through heroic deeds in battle, proving their worth to their peers and their tribe. A chief's power wasn't absolute. It was often based on the respect and loyalty of his followers, and that loyalty had to be earned and maintained. This dynamic system was both a source of strength, as it encouraged great personal courage, and a source of weakness, as it made unified, long-term action against a powerful, centralized enemy like Rome incredibly difficult. Below the warrior elite were the free commoners, the vast majority of the population. They were farmers, craftsmen, and traders. They lived in small, round houses, often clustered together in small villages or isolated farmsteads. Their days were filled with the hard work of agriculture, raising cattle and sheep, and cultivating crops like wheat and barley. Their craftsmanship was second to none. Celtic metalworkers, in particular, were master artisans, creating not just weapons, but beautiful everyday objects from iron, bronze, and gold. Their famous La Tène art style, which we talked about, wasn't just for the elite. It adorned household items, making even the most mundane objects a work of art. These people were the backbone of Celtic society, providing the food, the goods, and the manpower that supported the entire culture. But perhaps the most fascinating and unique class in Celtic society were the druids. They were not just priests, but also judges, teachers, and philosophers. The druids were the intellectual heart of the Celtic world, a scholarly class who were exempt from military service and taxation, which is a pretty sweet deal if you ask me. They were the keepers of knowledge, memorizing vast amounts of oral history, poetry, and law. They held immense power and prestige, and their word was often more influential than that of a king. Their training was an incredibly long and arduous process, sometimes lasting 20 years, where they would learn about astronomy, natural philosophy, and the complex theological beliefs of their people. They presided over religious ceremonies, performed sacrifices, and acted as mediators in disputes, ensuring a form of legal and moral order in a world without written laws. A very modern concept for an ancient people, don't you think? Their existence is a clear contradiction to the Roman idea of the Celts as uncultured barbarians. The Druids were a sophisticated, organized, and powerful intellectual class, and their influence was a unifying force across the many different tribes. Alongside the Druids were the bards and the seers. The bards were the keepers of the heroic tales, the epic poems, and the genealogies of the powerful families. They were artists and entertainers, but they also played a crucial role in preserving the culture and memory of the Celtic people. A good bard could inspire an army to victory with a song of their ancestors, or shame a cowardly chief with a satirical verse. The seers, meanwhile, were diviners and prophets who practiced divination and prophecy, often interpreting omens from the natural world to advise their leaders on important decisions. Together, these classes formed a complex and interwoven tapestry of spiritual, intellectual, and cultural power. They ensured that the deeds of heroes were never forgotten, that the laws of the land were known, and that the gods were properly honored. This three-tiered structure, the warriors, the commoners, and the intellectual class of druids, bards, and seers, shows us a society that was far more organized and thoughtful than its enemies gave it credit for. It was a society built on a foundation of oral tradition, personal honor, and a deep connection to the natural world. This structure, with its checks and balances of power, its emphasis on personal achievement and inherited honor, was the engine that drove Celtic culture for centuries. Historians still argue about the exact nature of the relationship between these classes and whether the druids truly held sway over the kings. But what is clear is that this intricate social order was a hallmark of the Celtic world. It was a world that valued strength and courage, yes, but also valued wisdom, memory, and the power of a well-told story. To the ancient world, the Celts were synonymous with warfare, and for good reason. They were a people who not only embraced conflict, but elevated it to an art form, a central pillar of their heroic tradition. The stories of their battles, recounted by bards and recorded by their Roman and Greek enemies, paint a picture of fearless, almost supernatural courage. They were a people who fought for honor, for their tribe, and for the sheer glory of combat. Their fighting style was less about the disciplined ranks of a Roman legion and more about the ferocity of individual warriors, each seeking to prove their valor in the heat of battle. A single, magnificent warrior, often clad in little more than a cloak and a famous ornate torx, would sometimes step out before the main battle to challenge an opponent to single combat, a ritualized duel to demonstrate skill and bravery. It was a spectacle of honor, and the winner's praise would be sung for years to come. The Celtic warrior's most iconic weapon was a long, double-edged iron sword, often with a finely decorated hilt. These weren't just tools of war, they were objects of personal pride, passed down through generations. They also wielded spears, axes, and daggers, and their shields were works of art in their own right, often made of wood and leather, but reinforced with bronze bosses and fittings, and sometimes adorned with swirling La Tène designs. But what truly set them apart was their psychological warfare. Imagine being a Roman soldier, standing in your disciplined ranks, and seeing a horde of these tall, muscular men charging towards you. Many of them would be naked or nearly so, their bodies painted with strange, fearsome designs, and their long hair and mustaches blowing in the wind. As they charged, they would let out a terrifying battle cry, a chorus of shouts and roars that was designed to terrify and unnerve their enemies. The Greek historian Polybius described them as a truly fearsome sight, noting how the Celts would fight with such a terrifying roar and wild passion that it was difficult for a disciplined soldier to not be shaken. They were masters of the hit-and-run raid, the surprise ambush, and the devastating cavalry charge. Their war chariots, particularly in Britain, were a thing of terror, with warriors riding into battle, throwing spears, and then leaping out to fight on foot, a maneuver that must have looked utterly chaotic and deadly to any opponent not used to such a display. The leadership of these armies often fell to a charismatic chief, a man whose personal magnetism and heroic deeds had won him the loyalty of his followers. We'll meet one of the most famous later, a man whose name still echoes in the legends of Gaul. These generals weren't just strategists. They were poets of war, men who could inspire their warriors to superhuman feats of bravery. Their armies weren't standing legions. They were gatherings of tribal warriors, each man owing his allegiance to his own chieftain. This system, while great for raiding and local dominance, made it difficult to unite all the Celtic tribes against a common enemy for a sustained period. They were brilliant at winning battles, but not always as good at winning wars. Despite their reputation for wild, untamed fury, there was a code of honor at play. The concept of Galatia, a shared sense of loyalty and honor, bound these warriors together. Their courage wasn't just a blind rage, it was a conscious, celebrated virtue. This heroic ethos is beautifully captured in the tales of Celtic mythology, in stories like the Tyne Bo Cuailnge, or the cattle raid of Cooley, where the hero Cuchulainn single-handedly holds off an entire army. The stories, while fictional, reflect the values that were so important to the Celtic world. The celebration of the individual hero, the importance of honor, and the idea that a glorious death in battle was better than a long, cowardly life. The Romans, on the other hand, valued discipline, formation, and the victory of the collective. This fundamental difference in military philosophy would play a key role in the long struggle between the two cultures. Historians still argue whether the Celtic fighting style was an act of tactical brilliance or a result of their tribal disunity, but there is no doubt that it was effective, at least for a time. Their victories were often stunning, their losses were epic, and their military legacy would be a major influence on the way the Romans would fight for centuries to come. The Celts were not just soldiers. They were heroes in their own stories, and their praise in battle was the highest honor they could achieve. And so, we arrive at one of the most famous and pivotal moments in early Celtic history, a moment so significant it would forever be seared into the memory of a young, ambitious city-state on the banks of the Tiber. The year is 390 BC. The setting is Rome, a city still very much in its infancy, a growing power but not yet the master of the Mediterranean. To the north, in the fertile Po Valley of what is now northern Italy, a powerful Celtic tribe known as the Senones had settled. Under the charismatic leadership of a chieftain named Brennus, they began to move south. A formidable host of warriors driven by a hunger for land and plunder. They weren't a unified army of all the Celtic tribes, but a very large and determined war band, a testament to the power and influence a single, heroic leader could command. Their movement was a shock to the Etruscans and other peoples of central Italy, and their reputation preceded them as a force of untamed nature. The Romans, hearing of this massive Celtic host, sent an army to meet them. The two forces clashed at the Battle of the Alaia, a small river just a short distance from the city walls. The Roman army, confident in its discipline and superior organization, was utterly and completely routed. It was a disaster, a humiliation on a scale the young republic had never experienced. The Celts, with their ferocious charge and terrifying battle cries, shattered the Roman lines. The Roman soldiers broke and fled, many drowning in the river in their panic. This was a stunning victory for the Celts, a demonstration of their power and a moment of immense glory for Brennus and his warriors. The Romans had just learned a hard and painful lesson about their new northern neighbors. With the Roman army scattered, the path to the city of Rome itself was wide open. The Celts, under Brennus, marched into the city. The citizens, in a state of sheer terror, had largely fled. Most of the population had sought refuge in the surrounding countryside, or had crammed themselves into the city's main stronghold, the Capitoline Hill, a natural fortress. The Gauls, finding the city empty, proceeded to sack it. They plundered the temples, burned the wooden houses, and basically did what raiders do. They laid waste to the city. The famous story of the sacred geese of Juno comes from this period. The Gauls, in a surprise night attack, attempted to scale the walls of the Capitoline Hill, but the sacred geese, kept in the temple of Juno, alerted by the invaders, began to honk loudly, waking the Roman defenders. This allowed the Romans to repel the attack. It's a fun story, and whether it's entirely true or a bit of Roman propaganda, it certainly shows the Romans were not going to give up easily. The geese saved the day, which, let's be honest, is a bit of a low point for a military superpower. The siege of the Capitoline Hill dragged on for months. The Romans, trapped on the hill, were starving. A ransom was eventually agreed upon. The Celts would leave in exchange for a massive amount of gold. As the gold was being weighed, the story goes, the Romans complained that the Celts were using false weights. Brennus, in a move of pure, unadulterated swagger, is said to have thrown his heavy iron sword onto the scales and proclaimed Vae Victis, which means woe to the vanquished. It was a moment of utter dominance and a painful reminder for the Romans that they were at the mercy of their conquerors. They had no choice but to pay the ransom. This was a moment of true heroic triumph for the Celts, a moment where they stood tall as the masters of the ancient world's future capital. The Celts eventually left with their gold and their pride, but the sack of Rome left an indelible scar on the Roman psyche. It was a national trauma, a source of shame and fear that would linger for centuries. The Romans would never again forget the threat from the north. This event, more than any other, fueled their subsequent policy of expansion and conquest. They had to deal with the Gauls once and for all. So, while the sack of Rome was a stunning victory for the Celts and a showcase of their raw military power, it also planted the seeds of their own destruction. It set in motion a chain of events that would see the Romans one day systematically conquer every single Celtic tribe in Italy and beyond. For a moment in time, however, the Celts were on top of the world. It was a victory of the wild, untamed warrior over the disciplined, ordered soldier, a moment that stands as a testament to the heroic courage that defined the Celtic way of war. With the Celts now firmly established across a vast swath of Europe, their spiritual life and religious beliefs become a central part of their story. Unlike the Romans and Greeks, who built great temples to house their pantheon of gods, the Celts had a different approach. Their religion was deeply connected to the natural world. Their sacred spaces were not grand, man-made structures, but rather groves of trees, springs of water, and lonely hilltops. They saw the divine in the rustling of leaves, in the bubbling of a spring, and in the silent strength of a massive, ancient oak tree. The natural world was not just a resource to be exploited. It was a living, breathing landscape filled with deities and spirits. This deep reverence for nature is a recurring theme in all things Celtic, from their art to their mythology. It was a religion of the landscape, where every river had a goddess and every mountain held a spirit. At the heart of this religious system were the druids, the intellectual and spiritual elite we discussed earlier. They were the intermediaries between the human and divine worlds, the keepers of sacred knowledge and ritual. They presided over the most important religious ceremonies, which often involved animal sacrifices. Some Roman and Greek writers, with a flair for the dramatic and a clear political agenda, spoke of human sacrifices, and while archaeological evidence is murky, the practice was likely a rare occurrence, reserved for the most dire of circumstances. It was not a widespread, everyday practice, but rather a chilling rumor used to paint the Celts as savages. The druids, in their wisdom and power, guided the people in their worship, ensuring the gods were properly honored and that the balance of the natural world was maintained. They were a powerful and unifying force, a sort of pan-Celtic priesthood that transcended tribal boundaries. The Celtic pantheon of gods was vast and diverse, with local deities and great pan-tribal gods. They didn't have a single unified list of gods and goddesses like the Romans. Instead, each tribe had its own favorites, its own local heroes who had been elevated to divine status. However, there were some deities that were widely recognized. Lugs, the god of all skills, was a master craftsman, a warrior, and a skilled artist, a perfect reflection of the Celtic ideal. His festival, Lugnasad, marked the beginning of the harvest and was celebrated with feasts and games. Another important deity was Terninos, often depicted with stag antlers, a god of nature, fertility, and the hunt. His image has been found on artifacts across the Celtic world, a quiet testament to his importance. The goddesses were just as powerful, often associated with the land itself. The goddess Brigid, for example, was a deity of poetry, smithcraft, and healing, a threefold goddess who embodied the very essence of Celtic creativity and life. Many of these deities were seen as living within the landscape, their power residing in a specific hill or a particular river. The Celts also believed in a form of reincarnation. They believed the soul was immortal and would simply pass from one body to another after death. This belief in the immortality of the soul gave them a fearless attitude towards death in battle. Why fear death if it's not the end? This might sound like a joke, but it's a very serious part of their worldview, and it certainly played a part in their terrifyingly brave charge. This belief system, with its emphasis on nature, its powerful priesthood of druids, and its complex pantheon, was a deeply held and meaningful part of Celtic life. It was a spiritual world as rich and complex as any other in antiquity. Historians still argue about the exact nature of their afterlife. Was it a paradise of feasting and fighting, or something else entirely? We don't have a clear answer, as the Celts, like the druids themselves, preferred to pass on their sacred knowledge orally, ensuring that the mysteries of their religion remained just that, a mystery. This decision to not write down their sacred beliefs makes it difficult for us to fully understand their spiritual world, but it also gives us a tantalizing glimpse into a culture that valued memory and spoken word above all else. What we do have, however, is a rich tapestry of myth and legend that survives in the medieval Irish and Welsh texts, a faded echo of a once vibrant religious tradition that was as beautiful and as wild as the lands they inhabited. While the Celts were making a name for themselves as fearsome warriors, they were also, and perhaps more importantly, a people of immense artistic and technical skill. The daily life of a Celt was not all war bands and heroic duels. It was also a life of farming, craftsmanship, and trade. The Celts were masters of agriculture, using iron tools like plows and sickles to work the land and cultivate a variety of crops, including different types of wheat and barley. Their settlements were a testament to their practicality and engineering know-how. They built impressive hill forts, not just as military strongholds, but as centers of trade and administration, with homes, workshops, and even ritual sites contained within their walls. These were bustling, lively places, filled with the sounds of blacksmiths hammering, bards singing, and people going about their daily lives. The craftsmanship of the Celts is where their true genius shines through. They were master metalworkers, and it's in their art that we find the most direct and beautiful evidence of their culture. The La Tène art style, which we've mentioned before, is the pinnacle of this artistic expression. It's a style defined by its flowing, curvilinear lines, its intricate spirals, and its use of abstract, often zoomorphic motifs. You might see a human face hidden in a vine, or a bird's beak forming a spiral, a sense of movement and energy captured in static metal. They worked with bronze, iron, and gold, creating not just weapons, but also everyday objects of breathtaking beauty. A bronze mirror found in a grave might be decorated with an intricate pattern of swirling lines. A piece of jewelry might be adorned with a delicate knotwork design. These weren't just objects, they were statements of identity and status. The Celts were also famous for their production of finely crafted goods that they traded far and wide. They traded with the Greeks, the Romans, and other tribes, exchanging their metalwork, wool, and agricultural products for things they couldn't produce themselves, like wine and luxury items from the Mediterranean. This network of trade meant that Celtic ideas and art styles spread far beyond the borders of their own settlements. A Celtic-style brooch might be found in a Roman grave, a testament to the interconnectedness of the ancient world and the high regard in which Celtic craftsmanship was held. The Romans, despite their later efforts to portray the Celts as uncultured savages, were in fact quite impressed with their metalworking skills and their art. But beyond the grand artistry, the Celts had a rich culture of everyday life. They were a people who loved feasting, drinking, and telling stories. Their feasts were epic affairs, where warriors would gather in great halls, sit on comfortable cushions, and listen to the bards recount the deeds of their ancestors. They drank mead and beer from beautifully crafted wooden bowls, or sometimes even from the skulls of their enemies, a practice that, while a little grisly for modern tastes, was a sign of a warrior's ultimate triumph. This love of feasting and hospitality was a central part of their society. It was in these halls, over food and drink, that alliances were forged, rivalries were settled, and the shared heritage of the Celtic people was passed down from one generation to the next. Historians still debate the exact nature of their settlements. Were they primarily small, rural villages, or were there larger, more permanent proto-urban centers? The evidence suggests a mix of both. There were small farmsteads and villages, but there were also the oppida, large fortified settlements that were often built on hilltops and served as centers of commerce and power. These oppida, with their massive earthworks and complex defensive systems, were more than just military forts. They were thriving towns, filled with workshops, markets, and homes. They were the bustling heart of the Celtic world, and their existence once again challenges the old Roman idea of the Celts as mere wanderers. They were a people who built, created, and lived rich and complex lives, a testament to a culture that was as creative as it was courageous. The art, the tools, and the very structure of their settlements all tell a story of a people who were not just surviving, but thriving. As the Celts were expanding and carving out their own identities, they inevitably came into contact with the established powers of the Mediterranean world. One of the most fascinating and consequential of these interactions was with the Hellenistic world, the kingdoms and city-states that emerged after the death of Alexander the Great. The Greeks had long been aware of the Celts, whom they called the Keltoi, and their first impressions were a mix of admiration and fear. They saw them as a tall, blonde, and fearless people, a race of heroic warriors, but also as a wild and unpredictable force. This dynamic would play out in a series of dramatic encounters that would leave a lasting impression on both cultures. One of the most common points of contact was through mercenary work. The Celts, with their fierce reputation and skill in battle, were highly sought-after soldiers for hire. Hellenistic rulers in places like Egypt, Asia Minor, and Greece itself hired Celtic warriors to fight in their armies, often paying them in gold and land. This mercenary service was a source of great wealth for the Celts, but it also exposed them to the wider world and the more organized strategic warfare of the Greeks. It's a bit of a funny situation, isn't it? The very people who were feared for their chaotic charge were also valued for their discipline, at least when someone was paying them. This mercenary service saw Celtic warriors fighting far from their homes in places like the deserts of Egypt and the mountainous terrain of Anatolia, a testament to their widespread influence and adaptability. The Celts also clashed directly with the Hellenistic kingdoms. In 279 BC, a large Celtic army, led by a chief named Bulgios, invaded Macedon. The Macedonian king, Ptolemy Keranos, a man named after the famous Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, was overconfident and foolishly chose to meet them head-on. The Celts, with their overwhelming numbers and ferocious attack, completely routed the Macedonians and killed the king, a humbling moment for the heirs of Alexander. This was followed by a subsequent invasion of Greece itself. The Celts pushed all the way south, reaching the sacred sanctuary of Delphi. The Greeks, however, united against this common enemy, and in a hard-fought battle managed to defeat the invaders, largely due to their superior tactics in the mountainous terrain. This victory was celebrated throughout the Greek world as a triumph of civilization over barbarism. While these invasions were ultimately repelled, they had a lasting impact. They demonstrated the sheer power and reach of the Celtic people, a force that could march from the heart of Europe all the way to the heart of Greece. It was a wake-up call for the Hellenistic world, a reminder that new, powerful forces were at play beyond their traditional borders. It also led to the settlement of a significant Celtic group in Asia Minor, a group that had broken away from the main invasion force. These were the Galatians, and their story is a unique chapter in Celtic history. They settled in what is now central Turkey, a region that would forever be known as Galatia, and for a time they were a powerful and feared presence, raiding their neighbors and serving as mercenaries. They even established a kingdom of their own, an island of Celtic culture in a sea of Greek and Anatolian influences. The famous statue, the Dying Gaul, now in Rome, is believed to be a Roman copy of a Hellenistic work commissioned by the king of Pergamon to celebrate his victory over these very Galatians. It captures the heroic yet defeated spirit of the Celtic warrior, a powerful piece of propaganda, but also a testament to the respect and fear they inspired. This period of interaction with the Hellenistic world was crucial. It wasn't a one-sided affair. The Celts absorbed Greek ideas, art, and technology, and the Greeks, in turn, were fascinated by the Celts. The Greeks, with their love of history and storytelling, left us some of the first written accounts of Celtic life and customs. This period, from the hiring of mercenaries to the outright clashes, shows a Celtic people who were not isolated but were active participants in the great movements of the ancient world. They were not just a problem for Rome. They were a force that shaped the politics and history of the entire Mediterranean and Near East, leaving their mark in the most unexpected of places. This period of contact and conflict set the stage for their next great challenge, a challenge that would come from an even more organized and determined power, the Roman Republic. As the Celtic world interacted with the Hellenistic East, another group of Celts, the Galatians, were busy carving out a new home for themselves. This story is an incredible example of Celtic adaptability and resilience. After a large-scale Celtic invasion of the Balkans and Greece was repelled in 279 BC, a significant portion of the army, around 20,000 strong, turned eastward. They were invited by Nicomedes of Bithynia, a Hellenistic king who was embroiled in a civil war and needed mercenaries. He needed their help, and the price was a new home in his lands. It was a Faustian bargain, a classic case of inviting a wolf into the sheepfold. The Celts, with their warrior prowess, helped Nicomedes win his war, and as payment, he gave them a large tract of land in the interior of Asia Minor, a land that would forever be known as Galatia, named after the Celts themselves, whom the Greeks called Galatai. The Galatians were not a single unified group, but a confederation of three major tribes, the Tectosages, the Trochmi, and the Tolistobogi. They settled in a region that was centrally located in modern-day Turkey, a land of rolling plains and rugged hills. From this new home, they began to do what they did best: raid and plunder their neighbors. The surrounding Hellenistic kingdoms, with their rich cities and fertile farmlands, were ripe for the picking. For a time, the Galatians were the new power in the region, a terrifying force that could extract tribute from kings and sack towns with impunity. The Galatian raids became a constant source of fear and anxiety, and rulers across Asia Minor had to either pay them off or hire them to fight their own wars. They were a bit like a protection racket, but with more swords and less paperwork. This period of Galatian dominance reached a climax in the mid-3rd century BC. They were a major military force, and for a time they seemed unstoppable. However, their raiding and their presence were a constant source of instability in the region, and it was only a matter of time before a powerful ruler decided to take them on. That ruler was Attalus, Soter of Pergamon. He was a savvy and determined king who refused to pay tribute and instead chose to fight. In a series of decisive battles in the 230s BC, Attalus managed to defeat the Galatians and confine them to their territories. This was a major victory for the Hellenistic world, and it was commemorated in art, most famously in the Hellenistic statue known as the Dying Gaul and its companion piece, Ludovisi Gaul, which shows a Galatian chieftain killing his wife and then himself rather than face capture. These statues, while Greek propaganda, are also a powerful testament to the Celts' reputation for bravery and their refusal to surrender. Even after their defeat, the Galatians remained a powerful force, but their power was now more contained. They became integrated into the political landscape of Asia Minor, often serving as mercenaries and sometimes as allies to the various Hellenistic kingdoms. When the Romans arrived in the region, they found a people who were still distinctly Celtic, speaking a Celtic language and practicing their unique cultural traditions, even after a century of living in the East. This is a fascinating example of how resilient Celtic culture could be, holding on to its identity despite being a world away from its original home. The story of the Galatians is a vital part of the larger Celtic narrative. It shows us a people who were not just confined to Western Europe, but who were a truly pan-European and even pan-Asian force. It's a story that highlights their reputation as fierce warriors, their adaptability, and their ability to establish a new cultural home far from their origins. The Kingdom of Galatia would eventually fall under Roman control, but the Galatian people would continue to exist, their culture gradually fading into the wider Roman and Byzantine world. The legacy of the Galatians, however, lives on, not just in the pages of history, but also in the New Testament itself. St. Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, was writing to a community of people whose ancestors had come from the heart of Europe. It's a remarkable and unexpected end to their story, an echo of a distant past preserved in the most unlikely of places. The history of the Celts is full of these small, almost forgotten stories that show us a people who were everywhere, it seems. The stage is now set for the ultimate conflict, the long and brutal collision between the Celts and the rising power of Rome. While the Celts were busy expanding and fighting among themselves and with the Greeks, the Romans were steadily consolidating their power in Italy. The sack of Rome in 390 BC, which we remember from before, had left an indelible mark on the Roman psyche. From that moment forward, the Romans saw the Gauls as their most dangerous and existential threat, a force of raw, untamed savagery that had to be contained and eventually conquered. The Romans had learned that their disciplined legions were not invincible, and they began to build a military machine specifically designed to counter the fierce, individualistic fighting style of the Celts. Rome's first major steps in this new era of expansion involved the conquest of the Celtic tribes in what is now northern Italy, a region the Romans called Gallia Cisalpina, or Gaul on this side of the Alps. The Celts here, the Insubres, the Boii, and others, were a formidable presence, and the conflict was a protracted and difficult one. The Romans, however, had the advantage of a centralized state, a seemingly endless supply of manpower, and a ruthless determination to win. They fought a series of bloody wars throughout the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, slowly but surely pushing the Celts back and colonizing their lands. The Battle of Telamon in 225 BC was a key moment, a decisive Roman victory that broke the back of the Celtic resistance in Italy. The Romans then proceeded to build military roads and establish colonies, gradually Romanizing the region and erasing the Celtic presence. It was a methodical and brutal process, a clear sign of Rome's new imperial ambition. The Celts in the Iberian Peninsula, the Celtiberians, also proved to be a major headache for the Romans. Spain was rich in silver and other resources, and the Romans wanted it all. The Celtiberians, a mix of Celtic and Iberian cultures, were fierce, mountain-dwelling warriors who used a deadly short sword called the gladius hispaniensis, which the Romans so admired they adopted a version of it for their own legions. The Celtiberian city of Numantia became a symbol of their resistance. For over a decade, from 143 to 133 BC, the Numantines held out against repeated Roman assaults. The Romans, in a display of their own determination, eventually sent their greatest general, Scipio Aemilianus, to deal with them. He laid a massive siege, building a series of fortifications that completely encircled the city. The Numantines, starving and hopeless, chose to burn their city to the ground and commit mass suicide rather than surrender to the Romans. The fall of Numantia was a tragic but powerful testament to the heroic, unyielding spirit of the Celtic warrior. This was a war of annihilation, and the Romans, with their superior organization and resources, were slowly but surely winning. These early conflicts show us a crucial difference between the two cultures. The Celts fought for glory, for honor, and for their individual tribe. The Romans, on the other hand, fought for the state, for territory, and for the long-term goal of conquest. Their legions, with their disciplined formations and their ability to campaign for years on end, were a military force the Celts, with their tribal structures and their love of a glorious single battle, simply could not match over time. Historians still argue whether the Celts, if they had been able to unite, could have defeated Rome, but it seems unlikely. Their very culture, with its emphasis on fierce independence and tribal rivalries, was their greatest strength in a single battle and their greatest weakness in a long, drawn-out war. The Romans exploited this weakness to its full potential, conquering one tribe at a time, making promises to some and breaking them when it was convenient, and gradually turning the Celtic world into a series of Roman provinces. The stories of these early conflicts, with their epic battles and tragic last stands, are a prelude to the final great struggle for control of Gaul itself, a conflict that would forever change the face of Europe. The long, slow conquest of the Celtic world reaches its epic and most famous climax in the Gallic Wars of Julius Caesar. The year is 58 BC, and Caesar is appointed governor of 3 Roman provinces, Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum. To a man as ambitious as Caesar, this was a golden opportunity. Gaul, a massive and diverse land encompassing what is now France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland, was an incredibly tempting prize. It was a land of immense wealth and resources, and more importantly, it was home to a large and powerful Celtic population that was, as usual, fragmented and often at war with itself. The stage was set for a conflict that would define the rest of Caesar's life and forever change the fate of the Celts. Caesar's initial justification for his military campaigns was to protect the allied Aedui tribe from their rivals and to prevent the Helvetii, a powerful Celtic tribe, from migrating through Roman territory. What started as a series of limited interventions quickly escalated into a full-scale war of conquest that would last for 8 years. Caesar was a genius on the battlefield, a brilliant general who understood how to exploit the Celtic weaknesses. He wrote his own account of the war, Commentary de Bello Gallico, and while it's a masterwork of propaganda, it's also our most detailed source for what happened. In it, he portrays the Celts as a mix of noble savages and treacherous barbarians, a convenient narrative for a man who wanted to be seen as a civilizing hero rather than a ruthless conqueror. For years, Caesar's legions marched across Gaul, fighting a seemingly endless series of battles against individual tribes. He was a master of siege warfare, a skill the Celts were not as adept at, and he systematically took their hill forts and settlements. The Celts, with their fierce, individualistic fighting style, could win battles, but they couldn't win wars against a disciplined and organized enemy. However, their fighting spirit was legendary. One of the most stunning examples of their bravery was at the Battle of the Sambre in 57 BC, where the Nervii tribe, a famously fierce group from what is now Belgium, launched a surprise attack on Caesar's army. The Romans were caught completely off guard, and for a moment it seemed like they might be routed. The Nervii fought with such fury that they nearly broke through the Roman lines, a testament to their incredible courage. It was only Caesar's personal intervention, fighting on the front lines, that saved the day. As the years of conflict wore on, the Celtic tribes, realizing they were facing an existential threat, began to unite. Their leader was a young, charismatic chieftain from the Arverni tribe, a man named Vercingetorix. He was a brilliant strategist, a true hero who understood that the old way of fighting would not work. He implemented a new strategy, a sort of scorched earth policy, burning his own towns and villages to deny Caesar's legions supplies. He united the disparate tribes of Gaul under his banner, something no one had been able to do before. This was the moment the Celts came closest to defeating Rome. The climax of the war came in 52 BC at the siege of Alesia. Vercingetorix and his massive army, a coalition of all the free tribes of Gaul, were trapped inside the fortified hilltop town of Alesia. Caesar, in a move of pure military genius, built a massive ring of fortifications around the city to starve them out. But then, an even larger Celtic relief army arrived to attack Caesar from the outside. Caesar's legions were now trapped between two Celtic armies, a truly dire situation. In a legendary siege that showcased Caesar's military brilliance, he built a second ring of fortifications, a double wall, to defend against the relief army. The ensuing battle was a brutal and desperate affair, with the Celts attacking from both sides. Caesar's legions held, and the relief army was eventually defeated. Vercingetorix, seeing the situation was hopeless, surrendered to Caesar, riding out of Alesia in his finest armor to lay down his weapons at Caesar's feet. The surrender of Vercingetorix marked the end of the Gallic Wars and the end of Celtic independence in Gaul. The Romans would now move in, establish their rule, and begin the long process of Romanization. But the story of Vercingetorix, the heroic chieftain who had united his people against the greatest power in the world, would live on. He was a true Celtic hero, a man who, for a brief, glorious moment, showed the world what a united Celtic people could accomplish. His legacy, as the last great Celtic hero of Gaul, is a powerful and poignant reminder of a brave, beautiful people who, for a time, fought against the coming tide of empire. With the conquest of Gaul complete, the stage shifted across the Channel to the island of Britain. The Romans had already made a brief and largely symbolic appearance there under Caesar in 55 and 54 BC, but a full-scale invasion wasn't launched until nearly a century later, in 43 AD, under the Emperor Claudius. The Romans were there for the usual reasons: resources and prestige, and the final subjugation of the wild, untamed peoples who had so long defied them. While the Roman invasion and occupation were a long, grinding process, the Celts of Britain did not go quietly. The most famous and heroic moment of their resistance came in 60 AD, led by a woman whose name still echoes with defiance: Boudica. Boudica was the queen of the Iceni, a tribe in what is now modern-day Norfolk in eastern England. Her husband, King Prasutagus, had been a Roman ally. In his will, he had tried to secure the future of his family by leaving his kingdom jointly to his daughters and the Roman emperor, hoping to appease the Romans and preserve some semblance of Iceni independence. It was a tragically naive hope. After his death, the Romans, with their usual ruthlessness, completely ignored the will. They seized the Iceni lands, enslaved their nobles, and in a shocking act of brutality that would prove to be a grave mistake, had Boudica publicly flogged and her daughters raped. This wasn't just a political miscalculation. It was a profound act of disrespect and a violation of everything sacred to the Celts. The Romans had just poked a very angry bear. The result was an explosion of rage. Boudica, a warrior queen of immense courage and charisma, rose to lead her people in a rebellion that would shake the foundations of Roman Britain. She was a physically imposing figure, described by the Roman historian Cassius Dio as having a flowing mass of red hair, a powerful voice, and a ferocious glare. With the Iceni at her back, and with other tribes like the Trinovantes joining the rebellion, she raised a massive army, a horde of furious Celts determined to drive the Romans from their land. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus was away campaigning in Wales, a stroke of good fortune for the rebels. The Celts struck first and hard. Their first target was the Roman town of Camulodunum, the modern-day city of Colchester, which was a Roman colony and a symbol of their oppression. The rebels sacked the city, slaughtering every Roman they found in a fury of revenge. The destruction was so complete that the Roman temple of Claudius, the last bastion of the defenders, was burned to the ground. The rebellion was a stunning success. Boudica's army, fueled by a desire for revenge, then marched on Londinium, London, and Verulamium, St. Albans, two of the most important Roman settlements. They met with the same fate. Both cities were put to the torch, and their inhabitants were massacred. Historians estimate that as many as 70,000 Romans and Roman sympathizers were killed in the rebellion. It was a moment of true heroic defiance, a powerful and glorious victory for the Celts, a moment where it seemed the Roman grip on Britain might be broken for good. The Romans were, for a brief time, in a state of sheer panic, and they considered abandoning the island altogether. But the Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was a tough and experienced general. He gathered his forces, and at an unknown location, he finally met Boudica's army in a decisive battle. The Celts were a vast, unorganized horde, while the Roman legions were a disciplined, veteran force. The Romans, in a narrow space that prevented Boudica's superior numbers from surrounding them, used their superior tactics and discipline to their full advantage. The battle was a massacre. The Celts fought with their usual bravery, but they were no match for the Roman machine. Boudica's army was utterly destroyed. Boudica herself either died in the battle or, according to some sources, took her own life with poison. Boudica's rebellion, though ultimately a failure, was a heroic and inspiring moment in Celtic history. It was a powerful reminder to the Romans that the Celts would not be conquered easily, and it was a symbol of the fierce independence that defined the Celtic spirit. It also had a lasting impact on Roman policy in Britain. The Romans, after the rebellion, became a bit more careful, a little less heavy-handed in their rule. The rebellion was a costly lesson for both sides, a moment of tragic beauty and a testament to the fact that even in defeat, the spirit of a people can shine brighter than any victory. Her story, as a powerful female warrior, also stands in stark contrast to the male-dominated narratives of the time, making her one of the most compelling figures in all of Celtic history. With the Roman conquest of Gaul and Britain now complete, the great sprawling Celtic world was brought under the heel of the Roman Empire. But this wasn't an act of total annihilation. It was the beginning of a long and complex process known as Romanization. The Romans didn't simply exterminate the Celtic peoples. Instead, they began a slow, methodical process of integrating them into the Roman world, a process that saw a fascinating blend of cultures, ideas, and traditions. The Celts, once a people of independent tribes, now found themselves part of a vast, centralized empire with a single currency, a single legal system, and a single language. The most visible sign of Romanization was in the building of towns and cities. The Romans, with their love of urban life, established cities with grid plans, public forums, temples, and theaters. The Celts, who had previously lived in hill forts and scattered settlements, were now encouraged to move into these new urban centers. This wasn't just a matter of moving, it was a fundamental shift in lifestyle. The Roman way of life, with its public baths, its sophisticated plumbing, and its love of wine and imported goods, was a powerful and tempting alternative to the old ways. The Celts, in their desire for the comforts and prestige of Roman life, began to adopt Roman customs. A Celtic chieftain might now live in a Roman-style villa, dress in a toga, and speak Latin. This wasn't always a forced change. It was often a choice, a way for the Celtic elite to maintain their power and status in the new political order. The famous Roman orator and writer Cicero, for example, had a Gallic friend named Vercingetorix, who had been a chieftain during the Gallic Wars, a testament to how quickly some of the Celtic elite adapted to the new order. Another key aspect of Romanization was the introduction of Latin. The Celts had a rich oral tradition, with their druids acting as the keepers of knowledge. But with the arrival of the Romans, Latin became the language of administration, law, and commerce. Over time, in Gaul and other continental Celtic lands, the Celtic languages began to fade, replaced by Latin, which would eventually evolve into the Romance languages we know today, like French and Spanish. The Celts, with their a new Roman name, were now Roman citizens, a powerful status that gave them legal rights and social standing they hadn't had before. The Celts, in their own way, had become Roman. However, Romanization was a two-way street. The Celts, with their rich cultural and religious traditions, also had an impact on their Roman overlords. The Romans, with their all-encompassing polytheism, were surprisingly tolerant of local gods and goddesses. They didn't try to wipe out the Celtic deities. Instead, they often assimilated them, equating a Celtic god of war with Mars or a Celtic goddess of the hunt with Diana. This syncretism, this blending of religions, can be seen in the countless votive altars and statues found throughout the Celtic provinces, where a deity might have a Roman name but a Celtic appearance or attribute. Historians still argue whether this was a true blending of religions or just a pragmatic Roman way of keeping the peace. But what is clear is that Celtic beliefs survived and intertwined with Roman ones. The process of Romanization was not uniform across the Celtic world. In places like Gaul, it was deep and pervasive. In places like Britain, it was a little less so, especially in the north, where the Romans never fully conquered the wild, untamed tribes of Scotland. And in Ireland, the Romans never even bothered to invade. The Celts there would remain untouched by the Roman juggernaut, a fact that would prove to be incredibly important for the survival of Celtic culture. The story of Romanization is a story of a people caught between two worlds, the old and the new, a story of adaptation, survival, and the quiet resilience of a culture that, even when conquered, refused to entirely disappear. It's a reminder that conquest is never a simple thing. It's a messy, complex, and fascinating process that leaves both sides forever changed. While the Celtic lands on the continent were being steadily absorbed into the Roman Empire, a different story was unfolding on the far western fringes of Europe. The islands of Ireland and the northern reaches of Britain, particularly modern-day Scotland, remained largely untouched by the Roman juggernaut. Here, in these wild and rugged lands, Celtic culture not only survived but thrived, a living testament to a way of life that had been all but erased on the mainland. The Celts of these regions, far from the Roman legions and the comforts of Roman civilization, were able to preserve their languages, their tribal structures, and their rich oral traditions in a way their continental cousins could not. Ireland, in particular, was the great sanctuary of Celtic culture. The Romans, for all their ambition, never launched a full-scale invasion of the island. They made some contact, trading and raiding, but they never established a permanent presence. As a result, the island remained a patchwork of independent Gaelic kingdoms, each ruled by its own chieftain or king. The druids, who had been systematically suppressed in Roman Gaul and Britain, continued to hold a central place in Irish society. The bards and poets, the keepers of memory, continued to compose epic tales of their ancestors, creating a rich and vibrant oral tradition that would one day be written down in the great medieval Irish manuscripts. The Irish Celts, with their intricate legal system known as Brian law, their love of poetry, and their powerful warrior clans, were living and breathing the Celtic way of life long after it had faded from the rest of Europe. In Britain, the story was a little more complex. The Romans built a massive wall, Hadrian's Wall, to separate their province of Britannia from the unconquered lands to the north. These lands were home to the Picts, a mysterious group of people whose name means painted ones in Latin, a reference to their practice of tattooing their bodies. We don't know much about the Picts, but we know they were fierce and independent. They were a powerful presence in what is now Scotland, and they, along with other tribes like the Scotti, constantly raided the Roman province, a constant reminder of the unconquered Celtic spirit that lay just beyond the wall. The Romans never managed to subdue them, a rare failure for a military machine that had conquered almost everything in its path. The Welsh, meanwhile, were a people caught between two worlds. They were Celts who had been living within the Roman province of Britannia, but they were also a people who, because of the rugged, mountainous nature of their lands, were able to maintain a degree of cultural independence. They spoke a Brythonic Celtic language and had a strong sense of identity. With the eventual withdrawal of the Roman legions in the 5th century AD, the Welsh were left to their own devices, a free people once again. But they were now living on the edge of a world that was about to change forever. The departure of the Romans left a power vacuum, and the Welsh, along with the other Celtic peoples of Britain, would soon face a new wave of invaders, the Anglo-Saxons, who would push them into the western corners of the island and eventually give them their modern identity. The survival of Celtic culture in these western lands is one of the most important chapters in the entire Celtic story. It was here that the languages and traditions were kept alive, a cultural seed that would one day blossom again. The Celts of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales were not just a static remnant of a dying culture. They were a dynamic, evolving people who were building a new future on the foundations of the old. Their isolation from the Roman world was in a way their greatest blessing. It allowed them to preserve a way of life that would one day become the source of new myths, new legends, and a new sense of identity for a people who had long been forgotten by the rest of Europe. They were a people who, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, were now poised to play a new and important role in the history of the British Isles. With the Roman Empire in a state of decline and its legions withdrawn from Britain, a new force was rising on the horizon, a force that would profoundly reshape the Celtic world, Christianity. The story of Christianity's arrival in these lands is a fascinating tale of cultural fusion, a blending of the new with the old. Unlike the Roman world, where Christianity was a structured, hierarchical religion, the early Celtic version was more monastic, more spiritual, and deeply connected to the natural world and the Celtic traditions of the past. It was, in many ways, a Celtic Christianity, a faith that was uniquely their own. The most famous figure in this story is, of course, Saint Patrick. According to his own writings, Patrick was born in Roman Britain in the late 4th century. As a young man, he was captured by Irish raiders and taken as a slave to Ireland, where he spent 6 years as a shepherd. He eventually escaped and returned to Britain, where he became a priest. But he felt a divine call to return to the land of his captivity and convert the very people who had enslaved him. Patrick's mission, which began in the mid-5th century, was a stunning success. He traveled the length and breadth of Ireland, converting pagan kings and druids alike. He used the very symbols of Celtic culture, like the shamrock, to explain the Holy Trinity, a brilliant piece of cross-cultural communication. The Irish, with their love of poetry and storytelling, took to the new religion with gusto, and soon Ireland became a center of Christian learning and monastic life. But Celtic Christianity was not a simple import. It was a synthesis of old and new. The early Christian monks and priests didn't simply stamp out the old ways. They often incorporated them. The old sacred sites like wells and groves were often rededicated to a Christian saint. The old gods and goddesses, like Brigid, were transformed into Christian saints, their powers and attributes transferred to a new Christian context. The stories of the old heroes were not forgotten. They were simply reframed within a Christian worldview. The result was a vibrant, unique form of Christianity that was different from the one developing on the European mainland. Celtic monks, living in isolated monasteries, created stunning works of art like the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels, which blended the intricate swirling patterns of La Tène art with Christian imagery. These monks were not just artists, they were scholars, copying and preserving not only Christian texts, but also the great works of classical antiquity, a quiet act of cultural salvation in a world that was falling into darkness. From Ireland, Celtic Christianity spread to other parts of the British Isles. Monks like St. Columba traveled to Scotland, where they established the famous monastery of Iona, a center of learning and evangelism that would one day play a key role in converting the Picts and the Scots. St. David became the patron saint of Wales, and Celtic missionaries like St. Aidan brought Christianity to the Anglo-Saxons of northern England. This was a missionary movement driven not by imperial power, but by a quiet, spiritual devotion and a deep respect for local cultures. Historians still argue whether the Celtic Church was truly separate from the Roman one, with its own unique dating for Easter, but what is clear is that it had a distinct and powerful identity. The arrival of Christianity did not spell the end of Celtic culture. On the contrary, it gave it a new lease on life. It provided a framework, a new way of expressing the old ideas. The bards, who had once sung of the old gods, now sang of the new God and his saints. The artists who had once decorated shields and torques now decorated illuminated manuscripts. This fusion of the old and the new created a culture that was as rich and as beautiful as anything that had come before. It's a story of cultural survival, a testament to the resilience of a people who, even in the face of immense change, managed to hold on to the very essence of who they were. The Celts had not been conquered by Christianity. They had, in a way, made it their own. As the Roman world receded and the Anglo-Saxons began to flood into Britain, the Celtic lands to the north has remained a bastion of a different culture. This is where we encounter two of the most intriguing and mysterious peoples of the British Isles, the Picts and the Scots. They were the unconquered, the people beyond Hadrian's Wall, and their story is one of fierce independence and gradual unification. The Picts, a name derived from the Latin picti, meaning painted ones, were the indigenous inhabitants of what is now eastern and northern Scotland. They left behind no written records, and our knowledge of them comes primarily from Roman and later Gaelic sources, which makes them a true mystery of British history. However, they did leave behind some amazing artifacts, intricately carved standing stones, covered in enigmatic symbols. We still don't fully understand what these symbols mean, but they depict everything from powerful beasts to warriors and clergy, offering a tantalizing glimpse into their society and beliefs. Historians still argue about what the symbols mean. Some think they are a form of proto-writing, while others believe they represent tribal identities, family lineages, or heroic deeds. Whatever they were, they are a powerful and beautiful expression of a lost culture. The Picts were not a single unified kingdom, but a series of regional polities, each with its own ruler. Their society was deeply stratified, with a warrior aristocracy and a powerful religious class, much like the Celts we've already discussed. They were formidable warriors, constantly raiding the Roman province of Britannia and later the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Their style of fighting, with its use of ambush and surprise attacks, was perfectly suited to the rugged, mountainous landscape of their homeland. They were a constant threat to their southern neighbors, a force of nature that refused to be tamed. Meanwhile, to the west of the Picts, another group of Celts was settling in what is now Argyll. These were the Scotti, a people who had migrated from Ireland. For centuries, the Irish had been known as the Scotti, and their raiding and trading had long connected the two islands. But in the 5th century, a more permanent migration took place, and the Irish kingdom of Dal Riata was established on the western coast of Scotland. These Scots were Gaelic-speaking, and their culture was very much a continuation of the Celtic traditions that had been preserved in Ireland. Their kingdom was small, but it was a bridge between the Gaelic worlds of Ireland and Scotland, a bridge that would eventually allow for the unification of the two peoples. The relationship between the Picts and the Scots was not always easy. They were often at war with each other, but they also intermarried and formed alliances against common enemies, particularly the Anglo-Saxons. The rise of Christianity, which was brought to both peoples by Celtic missionaries like Saint Columba, was a powerful unifying force. The monks of Iona became a crucial link between the Picts and the Scots, and the new religion helped to bridge some of the cultural divides. This process of fusion, of intermarriage and alliance, culminated in the 9th century with the reign of Kenneth MacAlpin. He was a king of Dal Riata, but his mother may have been a Pictish princess, giving him a claim to both thrones. He is credited with uniting the two kingdoms, creating the first kingdom of Alba, the Gaelic name for Scotland. This wasn't an act of conquest so much as a political union, a recognition that the Picts and the Scots had more in common with each other than they did with their enemies to the south. The unification of the Picts and the Scots was a pivotal moment in Celtic history. It was the moment when two distinct peoples with their own unique cultures and traditions came together to form a new, powerful kingdom. The Pictish language and culture gradually faded, absorbed into the dominant Gaelic culture of the Scots. The Picts, a people who had so long been a mystery, finally disappeared from the pages of history, but their legacy lived on in the new kingdom they had helped to create. The Scots would now be the undisputed masters of the land, a Celtic kingdom that would one day become a powerful and independent nation, a testament to the fact that even in the face of immense change, the Celtic spirit could find a way to survive and thrive. With the Anglo-Saxons now firmly established in what would become England, the Celtic peoples of Britain found themselves pushed to the western margins of the island. It was in these rugged, mountainous lands that the Welsh people, a continuation of the Romanized Britons, began to forge their own destiny. They were not a single, unified kingdom, but a patchwork of smaller, fiercely independent realms. These Welsh kingdoms, with names like Gwynedd and Powys, were constantly at war with each other, but they were also united by a shared culture, a shared language, and a shared enemy, the Anglo-Saxons to the east. The Welsh, for their part, called themselves the Cymry, a word that means fellow countrymen, a powerful expression of their shared identity. The Anglo-Saxons called them the Waelas, meaning foreigners, a name that would eventually become Welsh. A bit ironic, isn't it? The story of the Welsh kingdoms is a long and bloody one, filled with heroic kings, epic battles, and a constant struggle for survival. For centuries, the Welsh fought a losing battle against the relentless pressure from the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons, with their more unified kingdoms and their seemingly endless supply of warriors, slowly but surely pushed the Welsh back. The Welsh, in their mountainous strongholds, were able to hold on, but their territory was shrinking. This was a long, grinding war of attrition, a constant cycle of raids, battles, and sieges. The Welsh, however, were not without their own heroes. One of the most famous figures to emerge from this period is Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, a man known to history as Llywelyn the Last. He was a brilliant military commander and a shrewd politician who, for a brief and glorious moment in the 13th century, managed to unite the Welsh kingdoms under his rule and force the English crown to recognize his title as Prince of Wales. This was the first and only time a native-born Welsh ruler had ever achieved such a level of power, and it was a moment of immense national pride for the Welsh people. Llywelyn was a true Celtic hero, a man who had the vision and the charisma to unite his people against their greatest enemy. But this period of independence was not to last. The English crown, under the determined and ruthless leadership of King Edward the Celts, would not tolerate a powerful, independent Welsh kingdom on its borders. Edward launched a series of massive military campaigns against Wales, using his superior resources and his powerful army to systematically conquer the Welsh kingdoms. Llywelyn, fighting a losing battle against a seemingly endless supply of English soldiers, was eventually killed in a minor skirmish in 1282. His death marked the end of Welsh independence. Edward, in a symbolic act of conquest, built a ring of massive, awe-inspiring castles around Wales, like Caernarfon and Conwy, to solidify his control and intimidate the Welsh into submission. The conquest of Wales was a tragic end to a long and heroic struggle. The Welsh, in their stubborn resistance, had fought with a bravery that was worthy of their ancestors, but they simply could not match the organized military and economic power of the English. Their story, however, did not end with the loss of their independence. The Welsh language and culture, a language and culture that had been passed down from the ancient Britons, continued to survive. The bards and poets continued to sing of their heroic past, and the Welsh people, despite being ruled by the English, never lost their sense of a unique Celtic identity. They were a people who had been conquered, but they had not been broken. Their story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest act of defiance is simply to survive. It's a testament to the resilience of a culture that even in the face of overwhelming odds found a way to endure. As the Welsh struggled for their independence, another story of Celtic survival and legend was taking shape in the misty hills and ancient forests of Britain. This is where we encounter the enduring tale of King Arthur. The Arthurian legends are a fascinating blend of Celtic folklore, historical memory, and later Christian and chivalric ideals. While historians still argue whether a real King Arthur existed, the stories themselves are a powerful and important part of Celtic heritage. They speak to a time of chaos and uncertainty, a period known as the Dark Ages, following the withdrawal of the Roman legions from Britain in the 5th century. This was a time of conflict, with the Romano-British Celts fighting to defend their lands from the invading Anglo-Saxons. The historical basis for Arthur, if one exists, likely lies in a warrior leader who successfully fought against the Anglo-Saxons. He would have been a man who, in the absence of Roman authority, was able to unite the disparate British tribes and win a series of important battles. The name Arthur and many of the early stories have clear Celtic roots. The earliest mention of him is in a 9th century Welsh text, the Historia Brittonum, which credits him with 12 victories against the Saxons, culminating in the Battle of Mount Badon. This battle, which some place around the year 500, was a major British victory, and it is said to have halted the Anglo-Saxon advance for a generation. It was a moment of true heroic triumph, a beacon of hope in a time of darkness. But the real power of the Arthurian legends lies not in their historical accuracy, but in their ability to capture the spirit of a people. The stories, as they evolved over centuries, became a vehicle for expressing core Celtic values. The Knights of the Round Table, with their code of honor and their search for the Holy Grail, are a later, more Christianized addition, but the core elements of the story, the heroic warrior, the magical sword, the wise sorcerer, the mysterious land of Avalon, are all deeply rooted in Celtic mythology. The figure of Merlin, the powerful and enigmatic magician, is a direct descendant of the Celtic druids, a keeper of ancient knowledge, and a powerful intermediary between the human and supernatural worlds. The stories of the great battles and the feats of heroic strength are a continuation of the old Celtic heroic tradition, a way of preserving the memory of a time when the Celts were not the conquered, but the conquerors. The Arthurian legends, as they were written down and embellished by later medieval writers in Wales and on the continent, became a central part of the cultural identity of not just the Welsh, but of a wider pan-European audience. The Welsh, in particular, took great pride in these stories, seeing them as a reflection of their own heroic past. The legends were a way of keeping the memory of their lost independence alive, a way of dreaming of a time when a Welsh king with a magic sword and a band of loyal knights could defeat their enemies and restore the old order. They were a comfort and an inspiration in a time of subjugation. Historians still argue about the origins of the Arthurian legends. Were they a product of Welsh oral tradition, preserved and passed down for centuries before being written down? Or were they a later invention, a work of fiction created to give the British people a heroic past? The truth, as is often the case, is probably a mix of both. The core of the stories likely comes from a genuine, heroic figure, a man who, for a brief time, was able to unite his people and fight back against their enemies. But the legends, with their magic and their chivalry, are a beautiful and timeless expression of a culture that valued courage, honor, and a belief that even in the darkest of times, a hero can still emerge to save the day. The story of King Arthur is, in many ways, the perfect bedtime story for the Celts, a tale of a hero who, even in defeat, lives on in the hearts of his people. The quiet, monastic life of the Celts in Ireland and Scotland was about to be shattered by a new and terrifying force from the sea, the Vikings. Beginning in the late 8th century, these Norse raiders, with their longships and their ruthless efficiency, began to raid the coasts of the British Isles. The monasteries, with their wealth of gold and silver treasures and their undefended nature, were a particularly tempting target. The famous monasteries of Iona, a center of Celtic Christianity, was sacked multiple times, and its monks were either killed or forced to flee. This period of Viking raids was a time of terror and devastation for the Celtic peoples. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were also colonizers, and they established permanent settlements, particularly in Ireland. In Ireland, the Vikings established coastal strongholds that would one day grow into cities like Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick. These were Viking towns, but they were also centers of trade and commerce, and the Irish, after an initial period of resistance, began to interact and intermarry with the Norse settlers. The Vikings brought with them a new wave of political instability, but they also brought new technologies and new ideas. The Irish, in their turn, adopted some of the Viking ways, particularly in their shipbuilding and their use of armor. The result was a fascinating blend of cultures, a unique Hiberno-Norse society that was a mix of Celtic and Viking traditions. The Irish, however, did not take this lying down. A series of powerful Irish chieftains and kings rose to fight back against the Viking menace. The most famous of these Celtic heroes was Brian Boru. He was a king of Munster who, in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, managed to unite the fractious Irish kingdoms and drive the Vikings from power. He was a brilliant military strategist and a charismatic leader who for a brief time was the undisputed High King of Ireland. His story, a classic tale of a hero rising to save his people, culminates in the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. Brian's Irish forces, fighting a massive army of Vikings and their Irish allies, won a decisive victory. But the victory came at a terrible price. Brian himself was killed in his tent after the battle. His death, a tragic end to a heroic life, threw Ireland back into a state of political instability, but it also broke the back of Viking power. The Vikings would remain in Ireland, but they would never again be the dominant force they once were. In Scotland, the Vikings also had a profound impact. They raided the coasts, particularly in the northern islands of Orkney and Shetland, and they eventually established a powerful Norse earldom there. The Norse settlers also pushed into the mainland, establishing colonies in places like Caithness and Sutherland. The Scottish kingdom of Alba, which we remember from before, was constantly at war with these Viking invaders. But like in Ireland, the Scots eventually found a way to contain and even assimilate the Norsemen. The Celtic rulers of Alba, with their love of a good fight, managed to hold on to their independence, and over time, the Norse settlers were gradually absorbed into the wider Scottish culture. The period of Viking raids and settlement was a violent and disruptive time for the Celts, but it was also a period of immense change and adaptation. The Celts, in their isolation from the rest of Europe, had been largely static for centuries. The Vikings, with their new technologies and their global connections, shook them out of their slumber. The Celtic world, in its interaction with the Vikings, became more dynamic, more integrated into the wider European network. The Vikings, in a strange twist of fate, had, in a way, helped to preserve and strengthen the Celtic identity. They had provided a common enemy for the disparate Celtic kingdoms, forcing them to unite and to fight for their survival. And in their fight, the Celts rediscovered their heroic past and forged a new, more resilient future. The Viking Age was not just a story of raids and destruction. It was a story of a culture that, in the face of an existential threat, found a way to adapt, to survive, and to thrive. Just as the Celts were beginning to recover from the Viking incursions, a new force from the continent was preparing to land on their shores. This time, it wasn't a group of wild raiders, but a highly organized and militaristic power, the Normans. The Normans were originally Vikings who had settled in northern France and, in a fascinating historical twist, had adopted French language, culture, and Christianity. They were a military elite, famous for their heavy cavalry, their castles, and their feudal system. Their arrival would have a profound and lasting impact on the Celtic world, an impact that would be felt for centuries. The Norman conquest of England in 1066, or under William the Conqueror, was the first step. The English, a mix of Anglo-Saxons and other peoples, were a formidable foe, but they were no match for the disciplined Norman army. With England now in their hands, the Normans began to turn their attention to the Celtic lands on the periphery. The Welsh, with their fractured kingdoms, were a tempting target. Norman barons, with the blessing of the English crown, began a slow but steady process of conquest, building their powerful motte and bailey castles in the Welsh marches, the borderlands between England and Wales. The Welsh, in their mountainous strongholds, put up a fierce resistance, and it took centuries for the Normans to fully subdue them. But the Normans, with their castles and their knights, brought a new level of military organization that the Welsh, with their more tribal style of warfare, simply couldn't match. But perhaps the most dramatic Norman intervention was in Ireland. The Normans, in a move that was as much about political opportunity as it was about conquest, began to arrive in Ireland in 1169. They had been invited by the deposed Irish king of Leinster, Diarmait mac Murchada, who wanted their help to regain his throne. What started as an alliance quickly turned into a full-scale invasion. The Normans, led by the formidable warrior Richard de Clare, a man known to history as Strongbow, quickly established themselves in the eastern part of the island, in an area that would become known as the Pale. The Irish, with their many warring kingdoms, were unable to mount a unified resistance. The Normans, with their heavy cavalry and their stone castles, were a new and terrifying force on the Irish landscape. The arrival of the Normans marked the beginning of centuries of English involvement in Ireland, a story of conquest, rebellion, and a deep-seated cultural divide. The Norman conquest was not a total erasure of Celtic culture. In fact, it was a complex process of cultural exchange and integration. The Normans, in their conquest, often married into the local Celtic nobility, and in a famous Irish phrase, became more Irish than the Irish themselves. They adopted Gaelic customs, spoke the Gaelic language, and became patrons of Gaelic art and poetry. This process of fusion created a unique Anglo-Irish culture, a blend of Norman military might and Gaelic cultural traditions. However, this fusion also led to a new kind of conflict, a conflict between the Old English, as the Norman settlers were called, and the native Irish. The English crown, in a bid to maintain control, passed a series of laws, like the Statutes of Kilkenny, which were designed to prevent the Old English from becoming too Irish, a futile attempt to stop a cultural tide. The Norman conquest of the Celtic world was a turning point. It brought the Celtic peoples into the wider European feudal system and tied their political destiny to the English crown. For the Welsh, it meant the loss of their independence. For the Irish, it meant the beginning of centuries of foreign rule. But in both cases, the Celtic spirit, that fierce love of independence, and that deep sense of cultural identity would survive. The Normans had brought a new order, but they had not and could not erase the old one. The Celtic peoples, in their own way, had found a new enemy to fight and a new reason to hold on to who they were. The Normans had brought a new kind of power, but they had not extinguished the spirit of a people who, in their long history, had fought and survived against impossible odds. The Norman conquest had brought Wales under English rule, but it had not broken the Welsh spirit. For centuries, the Welsh, a people who had been pushed to the western edge of their island, fought to regain their independence. This long, heroic struggle is known as the Welsh Wars of Independence, and it's a story of a people who, in the face of overwhelming odds, refused to surrender. The story is a series of tragic yet inspiring last stands, a testament to the unyielding spirit of the Celtic people. The English, with their superior numbers and their powerful castles, were a formidable foe, but the Welsh, with their knowledge of the mountainous terrain and their love of a good fight, were not easily defeated. The first major rebellion was led by Owain Glyndwr in the early 15th century. Glyndwr was a Welsh nobleman who, after a personal dispute with a neighboring English lord, rose up in rebellion against the English crown. He was a charismatic leader, a brilliant military tactician, and a man who, for a brief and glorious moment, managed to unite the Welsh people under his banner. His rebellion, which began in 1400, was a stunning success. The Welsh, with their guerrilla tactics and their knowledge of the land, won a series of important victories against the English. Glyndwr, in a powerful act of defiance, was crowned Prince of Wales in 1404, an act that symbolized the dream of a free and independent Wales. He even formed a parliament and a national church, a clear sign that he saw himself as the head of a new nation. But the English crown, under the determined leadership of King Henry IV, was not going to give up Wales so easily. They launched a massive military campaign against Glyndwr, using their superior resources to systematically defeat the Welsh. The rebellion, which had once seemed unstoppable, began to falter. Glyndwr's castles were taken, his allies were captured, and his army was slowly but surely ground down. The rebellion finally ended in 1415, and Glyndwr himself disappeared from the pages of history, a hero who had simply vanished. His legacy, however, lived on. He became a folk hero, a symbol of Welsh independence, and his story was passed down through generations, a quiet reminder that the dream of a free Wales was not dead. After Glyndwr's rebellion, the Welsh were officially incorporated into the Kingdom of England with the Laws and Wales Acts of 1535 and 1542. These acts abolished Welsh law, made English the language of government and law, and effectively erased the Welsh as a separate political entity. Wales, a people who had for so long been a distinct Celtic nation, was now officially a part of England. But the conquest of the Welsh was in many ways a cultural failure. The English might have conquered their land, but they could not conquer their spirit. The Welsh language, with its beautiful flowing poetry and its ancient roots, continued to be spoken, particularly in the mountainous heartlands of the country. The Welsh people, with their love of music and their powerful sense of community, continued to hold on to their unique cultural identity. The story of the Welsh Wars of Independence is a tragic but important part of the Celtic narrative. It's a story of a people who, even when faced with the full might of a powerful empire, refused to give up their dream of freedom. The Welsh, in their long losing struggle, became a symbol of Celtic defiance, a powerful and poignant reminder that a culture can survive even when its political independence is gone. The story of Owain Glyndwr, a hero who for a brief time united his people against their enemies, is a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, the spirit of a people can shine bright. It's a tale that in many ways is the very essence of what it means to be Celtic, to fight, to lose, and to never, ever give up. While the Welsh were fighting and losing their independence, a different story of consolidation and survival was unfolding to their north in the Celtic lands of Scotland. The kingdom of Alba, which we remember was formed from the union of the Picts and the Scots, was in a long and bloody process of solidifying its borders and its identity. For centuries, the kings of Alba fought against the Viking raiders from the north and the English kingdoms from the south, a constant struggle to defend their new nation. This was not a simple process. It was a complex and often brutal one, with rival clans and powerful earls vying for power. But out of this chaos, a single powerful kingdom began to emerge, a kingdom that would one day be known as Scotland. The kings of Alba, with their love of a good battle, were not just warriors, they were also skilled politicians. They slowly but surely brought the various regions of Scotland under their control, a process that was part military conquest and part political alliance. The Gaelic language and culture, which had been the dominant force in Alba, began to be challenged by the arrival of Anglo-Norman nobles from England. These nobles, with their land grants and their powerful castles, brought with them a new language and a new way of life. For a time, it seemed like the Celtic identity of Scotland might be swallowed up by the new, more powerful culture from the south. But the Scots, in a way that was uniquely their own, managed to absorb and assimilate these newcomers, and a new, more powerful hybrid culture began to emerge. The Normans became Scots, just as they had become Irish, and their names, like Bruce and Stuart, would one day be as Scottish as any Gaelic chieftains. One of the most famous and heroic moments in this period of consolidation was the First War of Scottish Independence. The English king, Edward VI, the same man who had conquered Wales, decided that Scotland, too, should be under his control. He invaded Scotland and for a time seemed to have succeeded. But the Scots, a people who had for so long fought for their freedom, would not be so easily defeated. Two heroes rose to lead the resistance, William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. Wallace, a commoner with a genius for guerrilla warfare, rallied the Scots, and, in a stunning victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, completely routed a much larger English army. His victory was a beacon of hope for the Scots, a powerful reminder that they could and would fight for their freedom. After Wallace's eventual capture and brutal execution by the English, the mantle of leadership fell to Robert the Bruce. He was a Scottish nobleman who, after a long and bloody struggle, was crowned King of Scots. He fought a series of battles against the English, a long and grinding war of attrition, culminating in the famous Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. The Scots, with their superior tactics and their fierce determination, completely defeated the English army, a victory that secured Scottish independence for centuries. It was a moment of national glory, a testament to the fact that the Celts of Scotland, with their fighting spirit and their love of freedom, would never be conquered. The consolidation of the Scottish kingdoms was a long and difficult process, but it was also a triumphant one. It was a story of a people who, in the face of constant external threats and internal divisions, managed to forge a single, powerful nation. The Scots, a people who were once a mix of Picts, Scots, and Anglo-Normans, had through a series of wars and alliances become a single people with a single powerful identity. This identity, with its mix of Gaelic heritage, lowland culture, and fierce love of independence, would one day be known to the world as Scottish, a powerful and enduring legacy of a people who, with their swords and their wits, had fought their way into the pages of history. With the Norman English crown now firmly in control of Britain, the Celtic spirit found its final and most enduring bastion in Ireland. For centuries, the island had been a mix of native Gaelic kingdoms and Anglo-Norman lordships, a complex and often violent tapestry of power. The Gaelic Irish, with their powerful clans and their unique legal system, were still a dominant force, particularly in the west and north of the island. This was a golden age for Gaelic culture, a period where the bards and poets continued to flourish, and the old heroic tales were still being told. But the English crown, with its ambitions of a unified British Isles, was not content to leave Ireland to its own devices. They began a long, systematic campaign to bring the entire island under their control. The story of the Irish resistance to this English expansion is one of heroic chieftains and epic battles, a final, glorious struggle to preserve a way of life that was rapidly disappearing from the rest of the Celtic world. The most famous of these chieftains were the O'Neill and the O'Donnell clans, powerful families from the northern province of Ulster. For a time, they were able to hold their own against the English, a testament to their military prowess and their deep-seated control of their lands. They were a people who, with their loyalty to their clan and their love of freedom, were a living link to the Celtic past. But the English, with their superior resources and their political cunning, were a difficult enemy to defeat. They began a policy of plantation, a brutal and effective strategy of confiscating Irish lands and giving them to English and Scottish settlers. This was a policy designed to break the power of the Gaelic chieftains and to create a new, loyal Protestant population. It was a strategy that was incredibly effective, and for the native Irish, a source of immense suffering. The Irish, in their own way, tried to fight back. A series of rebellions, known as the Desmond Rebellions and the 9 Years' War, were fought against the English. These were wars of immense brutality, with both sides committing atrocities. The 9 Years' War, in particular, was the last great stand of the Gaelic chieftains. Led by Hugh O'Neill and Red Hugh O'Donnell, the Irish for a time were able to fight the English to a standstill. They even won a stunning victory at the Battle of the Yellow Ford in 1598, a moment that sent a shockwave through the English government. It seemed, for a brief time, that the Irish might actually win their independence, but the English, with their seemingly endless supply of soldiers and their ability to fight a long, protracted war, eventually defeated the Irish at the Battle of Kinsale in 1601. The defeat was a crushing blow, and it led to the flight of the Gaelic chieftains from Ireland in what is known as the Flight of the Earls in 1607. The departure of the chieftains marked the end of the old Gaelic order. The clans without their leaders were broken, and their lands were confiscated and given to English and Scottish settlers in the plantations of Ulster. The Irish people, a people who had for so long been masters of their own destiny, were now a conquered people on their own land. But their story did not end there. Their culture, Their language, and their deep-seated sense of identity, a legacy of their Celtic past, would continue to survive. The bards and poets, now without their powerful patrons, continued to compose in secret, and the stories of the old heroes of Hugh O'Neill and Red Hugh O'Donnell were passed down through generations, a quiet act of cultural defiance. The consolidation of the Gaelic Irish was a long and tragic process, but it was also a testament to the power of a culture to survive, even in the face of immense adversity. The Irish, in their final stand, had fought with a bravery that was worthy of their ancestors, and in their defeat, they had created a new kind of heroism, the heroism of survival. The story of the Irish chiefs is a poignant and powerful reminder that a people can lose their political independence and still hold on to the very essence of who they are. In the aftermath of the flight of the Earls, the Celtic spirits of Ireland and Scotland found a new outlet for its defiance, one that was as much about loyalty to a lost cause as it was about a love of freedom. This is the story of the Jacobite rebellions, a series of conflicts that, while ultimately a failure, are a powerful and romantic chapter in Celtic history. The Jacobites were supporters of the exiled Stuart dynasty, who had been replaced on the English and Scottish thrones by the Protestant House of Hanover in 1688. The Stuarts, with their Catholic faith and their deep-seated connections to the old Scottish monarchy, were seen by many in the Celtic lands, particularly the Scottish Highlands and parts of Ireland, as the legitimate rulers. Their cause was a powerful rallying cry, a way of expressing opposition to the new, more anglicized and centralized British state. The rebellions, of which there were several, were a chaotic and desperate affair. The first major one, in 1715, was a failure, but the most famous and romantic of them all was the 45 Rebellion of 1745. It was led by Charles Edward Stuart, a man known to history as Bonnie Prince Charlie, a charismatic but ultimately naive young man who came to Scotland with the hope of reclaiming his family's throne. He was a symbol, a perfect romantic figure around whom the Scottish Highlanders could rally. The Highlanders, with their powerful clan system and their fierce loyalty to their chiefs, were a perfect fit for the Jacobite cause. They were a people who, in their isolation from the rest of Britain, had preserved the old Celtic way of life, with its love of a good fight and its deep sense of personal honor. For a time, the rebellion was a stunning success. The Jacobite army, a mix of Highlanders and other supporters, won a series of important victories, and Bonnie Prince Charlie even managed to march all the way south to Derby, just 100 miles from London. It seemed, for a brief and glorious moment, that the Stuarts might actually reclaim their throne. But the Jacobite army was a small, ill-equipped force, and they were no match for the professional, well-supplied British army. The rebellion's climax came at the Battle of Culloden in 1746, a windswept moor near Inverness. The battle was a massacre. The Highlanders, with their heroic but suicidal charge, were cut to pieces by the British army, which had superior firepower and a tactical advantage. The battle was a tragic and brutal end to the rebellion, and it marked the last time a major battle would ever be fought on British soil. The aftermath of Culloden was a turning point in Scottish history. The British government, in a move that was as much about punishment as it was about prevention, passed a series of harsh laws known as the Act of Prescription. They banned the wearing of the tartan, the playing of the bagpipes, and the Gaelic language. They sought to systematically dismantle the Highland clan system, a final attempt to break the Celtic spirit once and for all. The Highlanders, who had for so long been a bastion of the old Celtic way of life, were now a conquered people on their own land. Many were forced to emigrate, and the old way of life, with its powerful chiefs and its fierce loyalty, began to fade. The Jacobite rebellions were a tragic end to a heroic story. They were a last, desperate attempt by a people who had for so long been on the margins of history to reclaim their place at the center. But in their failure, they had created a powerful and romantic legend. The story of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the brave Highlanders, a story of a lost cause and a final glorious charge, would be told for generations. It was a story that in its own way was a perfect expression of the Celtic spirit, a love of freedom, a deep sense of loyalty, and a willingness to fight and die for a cause that was as much about the heart as it was about the crown. The story of the Celts, from their origins in the Hallstatt culture to the final tragic Jacobite rebellions, is a long and winding road. But their story does not end with the loss of their political independence. It continues to this day, a quiet but powerful force in the modern world. The legacy of the Celts lives on, not in a grand empire or in a single unified state, but in a collection of vibrant languages, rich traditions, and a deep-seated sense of cultural identity that has survived against impossible odds. The Celts, a people who once dominated a continent, are now a cultural presence on the far western fringes of Europe, a testament to the power of a people to hold on to who they are. The most powerful and tangible legacy of the Celts is their languages. While the continental Celtic languages all but disappeared under Roman rule, the insular Celtic languages, Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, Welsh, Cornish, and Breton, all managed to survive. Welsh, in particular, is a stunning success story. It is a living language, spoken by over 500,000 people, and it has a vibrant literary tradition that stretches back for centuries. The Welsh, in their long struggle for survival, made their language a central part of their national identity, a powerful and poignant symbol of their defiance. Scottish Gaelic and Irish Gaelic, while spoken by fewer people, are also experiencing a cultural revival, with new generations learning the language and embracing their heritage. The stories of the bards and poets, a tradition that was a core part of Celtic culture, are now being told in new forms, in new books and new media, a testament to the enduring power of a good story. The Celtic nations, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, and the Isle of Man, are not political empires, but they are powerful cultural entities. They have their own flags, their own national holidays, and their own sense of a unique shared past. The Celtic music, with its haunting melodies and its powerful rhythmic energy, is now a global phenomenon, with new artists blending traditional Celtic sounds with modern genres. The art, with its intricate knotwork and its swirling abstract patterns, is now found on everything from tattoos to jewelry, a quiet and beautiful echo of a past that is not forgotten. The Celts, in their long history, taught us a powerful lesson about the nature of power and the resilience of a people. They were a people who, in their love of freedom and their fierce independence, fought and lost against the greatest empires in history. They did not build great cities of stone, nor did they leave behind a written history of their own. Their story was, for a long time, a story told by their enemies, but in their long struggle, they had created something far more enduring than a physical empire. They had created a cultural legacy, a way of seeing the world that was as powerful and as beautiful as any empire. They had created a language, a poetry, and a music that even in the darkest of times continued to sing of their heroic past. And so, his story sank into legend, a tale of forgotten people who in their final, long struggle for survival had created something that would one day be as powerful as any victory. The Celts, a people of fire and fury, had become a people of quiet resilience, a people who, in their defiance, had found a new kind of strength. The sun sets on this long journey through the history of a people who once challenged the world. Their shadows, long and deep, fade into the twilight, but the echoes of their spirit and the whispers of their stories remain. The fire in their hearts, a fire that burned so brightly in their long and heroic past, now burns softly in the quiet corners of the world, a gentle light that continues to shine. End of script. Sweet dreams.